Why is the 80s the best cultural era? Everyone imagines the 80s in a different way. It depends on the individual and their life experience. Someone remembers this time himself. Someone was told about it by his parents. But in fact, to immerse yourself in the 80s era, you don't need to look for old cassettes and records. It is everywhere. Nostalgia for the 80s with its many references has taken over the entertainment industry and does not want to let go. Take for example the TV series Very Strange Things or the relatively recent weekend hit Blinding Lights. Sure, the 70s and 90s have their appeal, but in terms of influence these decades are far inferior to the 80s. This video is a great dissection of an era beloved by millions. It's about the secret of the 80s success all over the world. Probably the first thing that comes to mind when you mention the 80s is the music of that time. If the 70s was the age of disco, it was replaced by new wave. Rhythmic, groovy and dazzlingly bright, they were saturated and movies of the time, and advertising, and even fitness classes. Almost all the hits of the legendary Modern Talking, Depeche Mode, Duran Duran and other popular bands can be attributed to the new wave. Let's go back a little bit. Music used to be played with your hands. You took a guitar or a saxophone, sat down at the piano or drums and started playing. There were synthesizers, but they were simple analog instruments that most artists used as part of the accompaniment. And that's where the revolution happened. Affordable digital synthesizers with great sound appeared. The Yamaha DX7 is the most popular. Digital synthesis, especially its subspecies FM synthesis, made it possible to create sounds that no one had ever imagined before. At first, new wave continued to be called light punk rock with dance rhythms. Then someone came up with the idea to replace one of the guitars with a synthesizer, then another one. In the end, even the drummer had to be fired. The genre gradually became completely electronic. Sometimes this digital new wave current is called synthpop. This genre defined the decade. Neither before nor after had the world seen anything like it. But the influence of the 80s on music doesn't stop there. Modern music owes a lot to this era. Which genre is the most popular now? Hip-hop, of course. It started in New York in the 70s, but nobody recorded it then, let alone put it on the radio. Rappers didn't have a lot of money back then. They tended to live in the ghetto and rap just for fun. And only in the 80s happened the first real boom. The old school of hip-hop with its party lyrics was replaced by the much more talented new school. Technology helped here. 2. Affordable drum machines and relatively inexpensive samplers appeared on the market. Only in the early 80s and studios and radio stations realized that rap is very promising and began to look at it. In the 80th year about hip-hop almost no one knew, and already in the 90s, almost a third of the top 100 tracks in the U.S. belonged to this genre. The first popular rappers were inspired by disco. Disco also influenced almost all modern dance music. Most of its genres appeared just in the 80s and also thanks to available synthesizers. House came about when DJs decided to make disco beats more mechanical and add more bass. Techno is, in fact, the bastard child of disco and krautrock, and nowadays popular Eurodance is a logical continuation of the European disco tradition with rich arrangements and vocals. Many music genres in the 80s from the underground became mainstream. Indie rockers and thrash metallers started to pack stadiums instead of making music as a hobby in apartments and garages. By the end of the decade, these and many other genres had branched out, mixed in some ways, and spawned rave culture. These are illegal parties with relatively heavy electronic music. In the 80s, pop music got Madonna, a-ha, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, and Prince released era-defining albums. The punk scene gave birth to Bad Religion, Green Day, and post-punk gave birth to The Smiths, Boss, and New Order, a huge bunch of artists whose songs are still playing on the radio and on repeat. It's almost impossible to list them all. It can be said that there was a real music boom at that time, and MTV is largely to be credited for that. Another important breakthrough is music videos. It is believed that synthesizer enthusiasts were the ones who had the easiest time making short videos with music. The first music video at MTV showed was for the most famous song Video Killed the Radio Star by The Buggles. Heavy metal appeared at the turn of the 60s and 70s, but almost as in the case of hip-hop, commercial success waited for him far from immediately. In the 80s, artists began to experiment more. Of course, effects pedals played their role. The more committed the pedal, the more interesting and heavier the sound of the guitar. On the one hand, heavy metal became glam metal like Kiss. On the other hand, much heavier genres like thrash and death metal appeared, against which Iron Maiden seemed light in sound. These bands are Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth. The list is very long, and they became trendy too. It's also important to talk about fashion in the context of the 80s. It is a common phenomenon that mass fashion adopts the most colorful elements from musical subcultures. Metallists, who became wildly popular in the second half of the 80s, by that time wore leather, constant attributes of their style. Spiky bracelets, belts with plaques, of course, tattoos and piercings. All of this began to make its way into the mainstream. At first, modifications like tattoos or piercings were looked at as signs of a criminal or mentally ill. But the more young people listened to rock and metal, the more they tried to be like their idols. It was in the 80s that these things became commonplace. No one is surprised by leather jackets now, although before the 80s, they were worn mostly by hooligans. The metalheads picked them up from the bikers of the 50s, but they didn't bring this piece of clothing to the masses. It was the new wave, or, as they used to say in the USA, the new romanticism. As now, the legislators of fashion then were celebrities and popular performers. At first they kept elements of rock not only in their music, but also in their clothes. Simple leather jackets, one of these elements, simple enough to fit into any closet. Even later, the new romantics began to compete in who would dress more extravagantly. Blouses, tailcoats, even hussar capes. Such things ordinary people, of course, were not ready to wear, but put on things simpler. For example, tight business suits, narrow ties and horn-rimmed glasses. This androgynous style was what New Wave needed to set themselves apart from the punks. Originally they were all from the same milieu, but the punks went the other way and started wearing ripped jeans, jackets, t-shirts with band logos and sewing different items to it all, from extra buttons to pieces of fabric. While followers of romanticism tended to dress richer, punks, on the contrary, emphasized that they were from the working class. Skinheads did the same thing. Their most famous item of clothing is the massive Dr. Martens boots. Dr. Martens became a real sensation. They were worn by informals, fashionistas and ordinary workers. But the British influence on fashion of that era was not limited to them. The same skinheads, plus soccer fans, also introduced the fashion for plaid Burberry, Fred Perry polo shirts and Stone Island patch jackets. In parallel, elite American fashion was taking over the Western world. Ivy League preppy style was back in circulation. That's how wealthy students at the best universities in the United States dressed in the 50s. The same polos, jackets, blazers, turtlenecks, sweaters, Oxford shirts. This style was a response to both sloppy hippie clothes and overly bright, flashy images of the new romantics. It was the way mostly rich, young white people dressed. At the other end of the spectrum was hip-hop. When rappers got money, they turned their casual clothes into style icons. There's wide jeans, caps, and most importantly, sneakers. Shoes for this subculture was a whole religion, and the main objects of worship, Adidas Superstar and, of course, Nike Air Jordan. Now the original samples from the 80s are sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but even then they were very valuable. In general, it was rappers who made high sneakers and sneakers fashionable. Before that they were worn by athletes, and to see someone on the street in voluminous sneakers was rare. And this fashion lasts until now. The 80s are very diverse. The decade was not homogeneous. In the early 80s, everyone was into fitness. It was the era of nylons, velour and corduroy. With sneakers, people usually wore windbreakers or sweatshirts, or even entire tracksuits. Women often wore brightly colored leggings and gaiters, and men wore hockey jerseys and beanie hats. All of these clothes were also as practical as possible. In the 80s, women's fashion began to converge even faster with men's fashion. Jackets, tracksuits and pants were worn by everyone, regardless of gender. Tower dressing is the key expression here. Tower dressing for the cool top managers. Ties got wider and wider. Jackets caught a second row of buttons and shoulder pads appeared. In such clothes, both men and women looked more masculine, powerful and successful. With all the strictness of styles, colors on the contrary went into informality. Even more formal things like pencil skirts and vests, people began to wear bright colors. Another striking detail was Hawaiian shirts, which many people wore even at work. Perhaps the main symbol of the late 80s was the miniskirt. Designers were obsessed with them. At the same time, parachute pants became fashionable. The complete opposite of mini skirts, there have been other brands that have been defined for decades. Swatch watches. This is not some century-old company with a rich history along the lines of Rolex or Cartier. Swatch only came out in '83 and immediately won the love of almost all ages and social groups. There were both strict business watches in a metal case and plastic children's watches on batteries. And most importantly, all models were affordable. They worked on cords. Such watches are much cheaper than mechanical ones. Young people wore them, sometimes several pieces at a time. Another legendary accessory is Ray-Ban glasses, specifically the Wayfarer model. They were very popular in the 50s, but then they were forgotten. Then the manufacturer hired marketers to send these glasses to all possible movies and TV series. The most famous are The Breakfast Club and Miami Vice. Ray-Ban sales instantly skyrocketed from 18,000 to 1.5 million a year. And this model was also worn by Michael Jackson, Rick Astley, Billy Joel and a bunch of other stars. But the most legendary success story was the United Colors of Benetton brand. It was built on wild marketing. Benetton tried to emphasize social issues in its advertising campaigns, but it was very controversial. Here, for example, is a poster about fighting racism, and here's a series of posters about friendship between countries and cultures. The buzz around the brand was incredible. Benetton's revenue more than doubled in the second half of the 80s alone, and their clothes became the symbol of a decade. We can't leave out the hairstyles. They look a little ridiculous now, but back then they were just chic. Okay, the mallet and the mohawk are subcultural history, but the huge curly hairstyles of the 80s seem to be worn by almost everyone. Fashionistas used all the tools at their fingertips: mousses, hairsprays, curling irons. Very often hair was either lightened or dyed red. There's an important point here. I think you've noticed that a lot of things came into the 80s from the 50s. There's a reason for that. The fashion of this or that era is called revival, that is rebirth. When certain styles come back after some time. Back then, such a cycle lasted 30 years. But lately the fashion industry has been talking about cycles of 20 years. Why does fashion repeat itself? So that you don't have to squeeze something new out of yourself if you can use something that has already been invented before you. And why exactly every 20 years? The answer is even simpler. During this time the child has time to grow up. And not just grow up, but become solvent and someone who sets trends. People usually warmly remember their childhood, their vivid impressions, and want to surround themselves with things that evoke warm associations. This applies not only to fashion, but also to music, movies, and aesthetics in general. 80s kids wanted to wear and watch something similar to the style that surrounded them in their childhood. Demand begat supply, and the O saw the first revival of the 80s. All those Ray-Ban and Hawaiian shirts didn't come from nothing. They are elements of a particular aesthetic. While clerks in jackets were walking around the business districts of New York, the real money was made by men from Miami, wearing just such shirts and glasses. Miami embodied the spirit of the decade, the spirit of unbridled freedom and limitless self-expression. Let's start with the color palette. The first thing that comes to mind at the mention of Miami is either palm trees or neon signs. On the one hand, neon simply adds additional brightness and recognizability to the city's appearance. The combination of dazzling red, blue, purple lights creates a timeless party atmosphere. On the other hand, neon is a reference to the golden age of Las Vegas and a recognizable sign of underground life. The fact is that the neon craze of the 80s is also revival. Illuminated signs were used until the 50s. Then they went out of fashion. The places where they still shone were considered unsavory. It turns out neon was a symbol of the underground. From the underground to the fashion of cool clubs and parties was one step. The symbol was the money that was made by the influential people of Miami and also the casino and club owners. Beautiful life. Here is another attractive attribute of Miami. Where there is beautiful life and big money, there are fast cars of red color. This era gave us the legendary Ferrari F40, Testarossa, and of course the Lamborghini Countach, which would be updated to the iconic Diablo by the end of the decade. Of course, these supercars cost a lot of money, but Miami is all about making money and then spending it quickly. All this aesthetic of dangerous criminal luxury was imbued in many popular movies and TV series of the time. The plot of the TV series Miami Vice, for example, was partly based on real crimes that took place there in the late 70s and early 80s. Except for a couple of seasons, the actors dressed very characteristically: pastel colors, loafers, jacket over a t-shirt, and Ray-Ban glasses. Americans followed the Miami Police so much that they began to imitate the main characters in the style of clothing. People liked it so much that this aesthetic devoted entire works to gain. GTA Vice City, for example, is based entirely on this model. It was released in 2002, just when the first revival 80s. Another game, Hotline Miami, can be referred to the same way. The atmosphere of Miami even gave birth to a whole musical genre, retro wave. It is such a modern reading of new wave and other synthesizer music of that time. Talk about a movie. The number of cult movies released back then is off the charts, largely precisely because Hollywood had more and more money. Hence the explosive growth of what we now call classics. Action movies began to mix more actively with other genres, for example, adventure films. A great example is Indiana Jones with Harrison Ford. Indiana Jones went to a whole new level in terms of cinematography, acting, and even story. Another genre fusion is action comedy movies. I can't help but think of Beverly Hills Cop. This movie became a classic and created the template of the ridiculous cop. Jackie Chan movies like Armor of God, Police Story, and Young Master became the standard for staging fights. Finally, there were sci-fi action movies like RoboCop. Back then, a lot of American movies for some reason had to do with the police, quite possibly because of the high crime rate. Secondly, even if you take action movies, there were stars who came on the scene who became the faces of the movie industry of their time. This is Schwarzenegger in the first Terminator, Stallone, Rocky and Willis in Die Hard, and Van Damme in Bloodsport. The list is just huge. For many actors, roles in these films were the beginning of serious careers and cooperation with top studios. Pictures with their participation developed into successful franchises that continued to take the box office into the 90s, even later. And the actors themselves became sex symbols and ideals of masculinity. Let's not forget science fiction. This genre was helped by the development of special effects. For a viewer in those days to see spaceship battles and lightsaber battles was something forbidden. What about Ridley Scott's Blade Runner? The computer graphics there seem realistic even now. The cyberpunk atmosphere with neon streets and Vangelis music still inspire retro wave fans. And Back to the Future is still considered the legendary series of movies. As for horror movies, the 80s produced legendary images of Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Jack Torrance from The Shining. The movie The Thing is still considered one of the creepiest thrillers ever made. It initially failed at the box office because it was second to Spielberg's Alien, also a legendary movie, also about an extraterrestrial life form, only much more peaceful. But the audience still appreciated The Thing in the late 80s when it was released on cassette and shown on TV. Here is a very important detail. It was in the 80s that people began to watch movies en masse, not only in theaters. Color TVs and VCR tapes became widespread. Sales of televisions doubled during this decade, and they became cheaper. By 96% of American households had a color TV. That meant you could watch movies more often and pay for a wide variety of formats. You saw a movie, you bought a cassette tape. Music videos too, thanks to technology, could now be enjoyed at home. VHS was the leading videotape format. The interference, tape recorder sound, and specific color rendition of these tapes are all parts of the 80s aesthetic that are often reproduced in popular culture. Not everyone had computers then, so they played on stationary slot machines. In just 2 years from the beginning of the decade, their number in the United States more than tripled. They were placed either in special establishments or in cafes. There were already enough hits, such as Space Invader, Astros and Pac-Man. But in '83 the huge arcade market collapsed. It was time for game consoles. First of all, Atari and NES. Most game developers back then were from Japan, and almost immediately the Japanese came up with Mario. And the later Super Mario Bros. Game for Nintendo's console broke the Guinness record as the best-selling game in history, with 40 million copies sold. And that's in the mid-80s. Another legendary NES game is Duck Hunt. It's the second best-selling game in the world, selling 28 million units. That's despite the fact that it required a light gun. Near the end of the decade, the Sega Mega Drive era began. One of the first 16-bit consoles, it was immediately clear that the new processors gave the old ones a head start in both graphics and gameplay capabilities. Mortal Kombat and Sonic would come later. But it is believed that the golden era of video games started in the 80s, especially since in '89 such a cult thing as the Game Boy appeared. By all accounts, It was way ahead of its predecessor, the Game Watch. Anyway, the Game Watch was a completely different level, because you could play not only at home, but anywhere, in it all. Video games, music, movies and more. Lies the key to understanding the 80s cult. The first wave was caused by Generation X. In '89, they were between the ages of 7 and about 27. That is, they had most of the 80s in their childhood and adolescence. They were the first generation to enjoy both economic boom and technological innovation at the same time. And these little Americans fell in love with the 80s era and continued to reproduce it in popular culture to this day. Why is the 80s popular even among young people? Animoe is a feeling of nostalgia for a time you never lived in. When a modern teenager makes a neon and retro wave video, they are experiencing animoe. That teen is nostalgic for an era when their parents were children and teenagers themselves. But adults who caught up with the 80s can get that feeling, too. It's just that no one lived in the 80s that they imagine. There was no such 80s at all. For the U.S. and the West in general, the 80s meant, among other things, rising unemployment and the mortgage crisis. And just in the 80s, in the U.S., began an explosive growth of crime, which lasted as long as 20 years. If you dig deeper, you will find that in the 80s, there was a lot of horror in politics and economics. This just demonstrates the power of mass culture. It manages to overshadow even such problems. This is why the 80s are remembered by many as a bright neon time. Aesthetics overcame the memory of recession and rampant crime. That's how nostalgia works wonders with human memory. Write in the comments, what would you add to this story about the 80s era? And there are many other interesting videos on our channel, so subscribe. Video